You open a crate in a dark warehouse, wooden boxes stamped with foreign markings, a leather flight log, a manifest tagged humanitarian aid. The air smells faintly of oil and machine grease. That crate might contain food, or it might contain something that changes the course of a war. Welcome to the shadow economy of arms brokers, the people who never wear uniforms but often decide who wins, who loses, and how long a war lasts. Today we're diving into their world, who they are, how they rose to power, some jaw-dropping real stories, the tools they use, and why the line between dealer and war maker is so dangerously thin. Let's start simple. What is an arms broker, and why does it feel so shadowy? At its most basic, an arms broker is a middleman in the weapons trade. They connect manufacturers, governments, rebels, militias, and sometimes criminal networks. But that definition hides something. These are people who operate where law, commerce, and geopolitics meet, and often collide. They aren't the factory owners or the generals. They're not usually the pilots who fly the cargo or the soldiers firing the weapons. They're the connectors, the phone call people, the document people, the men and women who can make hostile governments suddenly look like legitimate buyers. Why the mystery? Because most of what they do is deliberately hidden. Sales are routed through obscure companies. Paperwork is crafted to look ordinary, and deals are sealed in private hotel rooms or on remote airstrips. When governments want plausible deniability, or when embargoes and sanctions make direct sales impossible, that's when brokers become essential. And that essentialness makes them dangerous. To understand how they became so powerful, we need to look at history. The story stretches across 2 centuries, but there are a few turning points. First, colonialism and empire. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, European powers and private interests moved weapons into faraway places through intermediaries. Local rulers, colonial administrators, and private firms all needed people who could translate between markets and politics. Then came the World Wars. Demand for arms exploded, and the logistics of moving weapons led to more sophisticated middlemen, traders who could find supplies where governments couldn't, or who could exploit legal loopholes. The real boom arrived during the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union weren't just selling toys, they were underwriting proxy wars. When superpowers wanted to arm friendly regimes or insurgent groups without public exposure, they often relied on third parties. Brokers with the right contacts became strategic assets. They could move surplus weapons from one theater to another, or source gear that governments couldn't publicly provide. Finally, the 1991 collapse of the Soviet Union was a watershed. Suddenly, vast arsenals, previously tightly controlled, were vulnerable, and many aging officers and logistics people found themselves with access to weapons, spare parts, and transport networks. The resulting flood of materiel into global black markets created a gold rush for brokers who could move arms from Eastern stockpiles into conflict zones in Africa, the Middle East, and beyond. So, over decades, a profession that had once been marginal became central in a very ugly global business. Profit and politics in one package. But stories help make this real. Let's talk about a few people who became infamous for this trade. If you want a single name that screams modern arms brokering, it's Viktor Bout, the Merchant of Death. Born in the Soviet Union, Bout transformed what looked like a handful of small cargo airlines into a worldwide logistics network. In the 1990s, he had a fleet of rusty Russian transport planes and a web of front companies. He flew everywhere, Africa, the Middle East, South America, and made himself useful to anyone with money and a need. Bout's pitch was simple and terrifyingly effective. If you needed weapons and the official channels were closed, he could get them to you, and he could get them there fast. He used cargo manifests, charter companies, and a blend of legitimate aviation business and shadowy deals. Investigations later linked flights and shipments to conflicts across Africa and to groups the US labeled terrorist organizations. In 2008, Bout was arrested in Bangkok in an undercover sting coordinated by US investigators. Convicted in a US court in 2011, he was sentenced to 25 years. That might have been the end of his story, but in 2022, he was exchanged in a prisoner swap, traded for a US citizen detained overseas. Bout's arc, from Soviet logistics officer to international fugitive to swapped prisoner, reads like a thriller, but it's also a grim reminder. The people who traffic in weapons can be remarkably resilient. Not all arms deals lurk entirely in darkness. Sometimes multinational corporations use brokers to grease the wheels of state procurement. In the 1970s, Lockheed, a major U.S. aerospace company, was revealed to have used intermediaries to channel payments to officials in several countries to secure aircraft contracts. Japan, Italy, the Netherlands, names and governments were implicated. In Japan, the scandal even touched former Prime Minister Kakue Tanaka, who was later arrested. This was not mercenary trade in remote jungles. This was corporate-level bribery, legal on paper in parts, corrupt in practice. And it exposed how brokering and influence can operate inside official procurement. When government contracts and national prestige are on the line, large firms sometimes treat intermediaries as necessary grease. And when that service crosses ethical or legal boundaries, the fallout can topple careers. Across the late 20th century, smaller but no less consequential brokers moved rifles, artillery parts, and ammunition into wars in Africa and Latin America. In Sierra Leone and Liberia, for instance, arms were traded for diamonds. In parts of Latin America, weapons and drugs flowed along the same networks. These brokers were often the link between resource grabs and armed conflict. They didn't just ship weapons. They helped shape who had the power on the ground. In a different register, the 2000s showed how even government's official procurement can be gamed. The case dramatized in the movie War Dogs involved young American contractors who landed U.S. government arms contracts and then tried to resell or repurpose materiel in ways that created scandal, legal fights, and embarrassment for officials. It's a reminder that the broker role can be entrepreneurial, reckless, and very modern, exploiting bureaucracy and gaps in oversight. Those examples show the range, from billionaire-style global brokers to small operators exchanging guns for gems. But how do they actually make deals? What's in the toolkit? I'm not going to give you a guide to illegal trade, but to understand the phenomenon, here are the types of strategies brokers use, kept at a broad, non-operational level. Front companies and shell entities. Brokers often run or use multiple companies that appear legitimate on paper. Cargo firms, logistics providers, consultancies. These entities create a veneer of legality for transactions that might otherwise be blocked. Legal and diplomatic cover. Sometimes a sale is framed as spare parts or training or humanitarian equipment. Brokers rely on paperwork and diplomatic contacts to move shipments through customs and airspace without provoking alarm. Cash and barter. When official payment channels are closed, deals are done through cash, commodities, or resource swaps, diamonds, oil rights, or mining concessions in exchange for weapons. Aviation and shipping networks. Small cargo airlines and charter services play a big role. Brokers contract flights that move material to remote fields or to countries willing to accept them. Again, that's a general description, not an instruction. Local intermediaries. A broker in Europe may need a local fixer in Africa, someone who knows the airstrip, the local commander, and the best way to port cargo ashore. These local actors are crucial cogs. Financial obfuscation. Payments may be layered through offshore accounts, third-party invoices, and opaque consultancies. The goal is to make tracing the origin of funds extremely difficult. Plausible deniability and political protection. Sometimes a broker operates with the tacit knowledge or protection of a state actor who needs deniability. That protection, whether from an intelligence service or a corrupt official, can make or break a broker's operation. So, brokers have tools, but what are the consequences? Why do some see them as useful and others as monsters? In some conflicts, a supplier might be the only way for a regime or a community to defend itself. A broker might be the only person who can get parts or replacements for aging weapons systems when sanctions block official channels. More often, brokers accelerate conflict, deepen violence, and enrich themselves while communities suffer. Selling arms to loose coalitions of militias or to groups with poor command structures increases the risk of human rights abuses. Sometimes, states use brokers to arm proxies while avoiding direct involvement. That enables geopolitical maneuvers, but erodes accountability. This duality helps explain why public opinion is often conflicted, pragmatic on the ground, but outraged in the press. It's the classic problem of shadow supply. Short-term advantages for some, long-term harm for many. And what happens to brokers themselves when things blow up? There are patterns we keep seeing. Some are caught and tried. Viktor Bout's arrest and conviction are a flagship example. Governments and international coalitions sometimes spend years building cases and then make dramatic arrests. A few manage to cash out and fade away, turning illicit gains into legitimate business, or simply disappearing behind shell companies and safe jurisdictions. Occasionally, a broker operates openly for years because they are useful to a powerful state actor. If that patron falls, so might the broker, or they might be quietly absorbed into other networks. In the messier theaters, brokers sometimes end up dead. Accidents, car crashes, or killings that are never fully investigated. When you traffic in arms, secrets and enemies can multiply. These endings underline the risk. You don't play this game without exposure to enormous legal and physical danger. Hollywood loves this stuff. Nicolas Cage's Lord of War borrows heavily from Viktor Bout's life. War Dogs dramatizes the teenage-to-contractor pipeline. These films turn brokers into anti-heroes, charismatic, amoral, and fascinating. But the real human cost is rarely cinematic. Displaced families, destroyed towns, Economies ruined by warlords buying weapons with a broker's help. That cinematic gloss can blur public understanding. It's easier to sympathize with a smooth operator on screen than to reckon with the corpses in a real conflict zone.
Do you think you